So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the UC ANR Fire Network's After the Fire Rebuilding and Structure Loss webinar. My name is Katie Lowe, and I'm the Fire Network Coordinator, and I'm also going to help facilitate the webinar this evening. So just as a reminder, this webinar is really for interested residents, resource professionals, and community members who want to learn more about rebuilding and dealing with structure loss post-fire. But before we begin today, I just wanted to let folks know that during this presentation, you'll see many pictures of burned homes, landscapes, and communities. And these images they may evoke a pretty strong emotional response, particularly for those of you who have experienced or been impacted by wildfire. So if you start to feel overwhelmed, please feel free to step away from the webinar and return when you feel comfortable. I want to take a second and introduce our speaker for this evening. We have Yana Valachovic from UC Cooperative Extension. Yana is not only a forest advisor and county director for Humboldt and Del Norte counties, but she's also the Fire Network's Community Resiliency and Built Environment Program lead.
All right, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all in the virtual space, and I want to thank Katie for inviting me here to give some thoughts about a very complex topic that I can tell by the audience members you all share in that space around trying to find solutions for fire adaptation and really figure out actionable.
Oh, we can see the notes. Yep.
That good?
Yes.
Thanks. Actionable ideas that you can take home to your own community. I want to let you know you're all guinea pigs with me tonight. This is not a talk I've given before, and so it's going to get better as I work on this stuff over time. Most of my work and the work of Dr. Steve Quarles, who's also with us tonight, is really in the retrofit space. And so the opportunity to build new and design new and think about what it means to live in a fire-prone environment and have the opportunity to really put your best principles forward is something that we muse a lot about, but putting words to paper was a little more complex than I thought it might be. So anyway, we're going to talk tonight mostly about structures themselves and thinking about, what it means to have the opportunity to build again. I know that a good portion of you may have gone through wildfire, and so you've seen settings like this where there's a surviving house and one that was not so fortunate. And so I just really want to send my heartfelt emotions out to everyone to say that I understand and I get it. Both Steve and I have the opportunity to work in this space and try and learn from situations where you see a structure survive and can kind of wonder what might have been the secret sauce behind that structure's success, and then to be able to share results of both post-fire studies as well as lab experimental trials where we can try and piece those practical solutions together. So this is a photo from Altadena, and I've got a smattering of slides all across California and even a couple from Colorado. So hang on, folks. And what I want to talk about today, and this is the agenda, and we've got some time for questions at the end. And Katie, if I start to go long, please text me because I won't see the chat as well. But I want to talk about the background around fire pathways, and I'm going to use this frame kind of how to break the wick. And within that, talk about for opportunities when building new, both in design and materials choices, give a little hint towards the trade-offs between moisture management and fire protection and what the systems are designed to do. And I really want to emphasize maintenance, because the fundamental issue here is that there is no single building product that's going to make the most durable house. It's really a combination between the right material, the right installation, and then having the property owner know how to maintain that and think about it, the functionality of the system for decades, really, because our houses and our buildings are really designed to last a long time, and so they take care and feeding, if you will, and it takes a lot of investment in that. So here's an image from Shasta County, and this is Siskiyou County, and this is in a post-fire environment. And here is how one family is choosing to redesign and restructure. And you'll notice that they've got a lot of hardscape around the structure, but they've also built in areas for future garden areas, very much focal points where you can kind of anchor something really green and lush, but they've given some protection towards the entire edge of the structure. Structure also made of an ignition resistant product and many other details within that. So we've got, I think, about an hour program here and then a good half an hour for questions. And as I said, there's going to be a little bit of a fire hose, if you will, and that I want to get through some vocabulary, some basic concepts, and then I'm going to dive deep into different components of the structure and talk about kind of trade-offs, as I said, materials choices, and then kind of what we recommend at this point from what we know. So first I want to lay a fundamental framework. When we look at wildfire exposures respective to buildings and we see surviving structures like this one in the Palisades, the surviving structure is a product of four really component parts, and they're all important. And I put them in order here, but we could probably rearrange them, depending on our perspectives here. You need a building that's got good products on it. The roof needs to be in good shape. It needs to have good installation as a part of it. If you have a good product but you don't install it right, then the product isn't so helpful. We're going to talk a lot about vegetation and fuels management near the structure because that becomes the wick from which fire can come from somewhere else towards the structure. And so looking at how that fuel arrangement is around the structure is really important. Which I mentioned earlier, the maintenance of the structure and the near to building fuels is really critical. And then the fire service, of course, is super important, and they are there to lend a hand as best they can. In like the Eaton and Palisades fires in 2025, right, resources were spread incredibly thin, and fire personnel were trying to get there as fast as they could and trying to help people evacuate as fast as they could. The time available for structure protection was far more limited, and so they were making decisions around where they could make an impact quickly and then move on to the next structure. So here's an example. This is a rebuild in part of the Palisades footprint, and there are a lot of choices that this couple made that really put that primary structure in really good shape. The garage was lost over here, as you can see on the left. The lot on the right had recently been cleared and a new building was getting ready to come in. That had some contributing beneficial factors, but you can see the ignition of the surrounding vegetation. And so, to me, this is a great example of good building materials, good installation, relatively good fuels management. It was essentially had an entire new exterior envelope, and so it was in great shape. So there wasn't a lot to maintain yet. And then there were firefighter response that enabled protection so that the garage didn't lead to spread towards the primary house. So here's a great example of all four of those principles coming together. There are a lot of people wondering, well, why do certain buildings survive versus others? What contributes to that? And Dr. Corals, who's on this webinar, has been at this for a long time. I really picked up in this space in 2017 with the fires in Santa Rosa, leading to the 2018 Paradise Fire. And, I also lived in Oakland during the Oakland Hills fire. And so it's an interesting evolution to watch how California has been thinking about these tough issues. And there are lots of stories or lots of examples of post-fire studies where you can see really specific evidence that contributed to survival. So here's an example of a house in Paradise. Every house was lost around it for almost an entire city block. And this house had been recently remodeled, and so it was subject to the California Building Code standards and related to wildland urban interface exterior performance. So in other words, the exterior of the building was subject to thinking about wildfire in general. And so this structure survives when the others don't. And what you see is that they had the new vents here. They had a tall foundation. They had a brand new roof. They had the use of a non-combustible walkway, so this sidewalk around the structure, all as contributing elements that put that structure in far better position than many others around it. You can see from the back door that there is a lot of ember burn on this piece of carpet remnant, which was used to keep the shoes clean as you went in and out. Why that's important is because the structure itself was also up for sale, and so it didn't um, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but there was another additional element there where there wasn't a lot of stored stuff around the house. It had been recently cleaned up for sale, and there weren't a lot of extra things that were laying around. So building was designed well, it was in great shape, and those pieces came together to really make a difference in the structure's survivability. I'm going to cover a little bit of vocabulary, and if you've been following these series, then you've probably been exposed to some of these terms, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about fire, we talk about three different pathways, and the one on the left, this concept that fire comes from somewhere else and burns through connected vegetation and eventually gets all the way to the house, is a term we call direct flame contact. This idea that flame is actually physically touching the structure. We typically mitigate that through the idea of fuel modification, which we call defensible space. And so that's about interrupting the pathway so you don't allow fire to stair step basically from the wildland to the structure itself. A key element is also this component where you get long distance transport of firebrands or burning pieces of small material, typically from the vegetation, but eventually can lift pieces from burning structures themselves. And so creating embers, which can travel a relatively long distance, like a mile or so. And if they land on something susceptible, they're able to create new spot fires. So you can see in the central image is this idea that there is something combustible around the structure that's ignitable. There's caught leaves and debris in the gutters, that's ignitable. And then there's the potential for those embers to go in and out or in to the house via the vents, as shown through the through roof vents on the top of the roof, or the gable end vent, which is right above the windows where my cursor is. And so you have this other element where it's not just about defensible space farther away, it's about thinking about fuels right adjacent to the structure, and it's thinking about how do we harden that structure so that we don't have that same porosity where embers can get inside. So that's a combination of a term where we call home hardening and defensible space to help mitigate against those embers. The third key concept is something called radiant heat. And that's where you get the transmission of heat through the air. You don't have flame contact, and that heat becomes so intense it causes either a smoldering or ignition or some type of failure on the structure. In the image here, we're showing the window pane and that the window pane is breaking. That creates an opening where embers can come in. But the idea is that there are elements that are weak points around the structure that can fail when there's a lot of heat exposure. So as we move into environments where we have more and more structures close to each other, preparing for radiant heat is a really critical component. So we're going to talk more about home hardening with respect to that and where the vulnerabilities are on structures respective to kind of that heat related issue. And so, the question is, what should you prepare for? The straight answer is that a structure to be robust to wildfire needs to be prepared for direct flame contact, needs to prepare for embers, and it needs to be prepared for radiant heat. So I'm going to move through a lot of concepts. You probably are familiar with this. People often ask me, what is fuel? We're talking about defensible space. What is fuel? And the answer simply is it's anything that's combustible. Where regulatory authority stops and starts, that's sort of a different conversation. But if you're to walk out of the environment that you live in tomorrow morning and look around, take a moment and just reflect on what fuel you might see. It could come from petroleum-based products like artificial turf. It can come from cars, garbage cans, connected wood fences, mulch. All of these things are capable of ignition, and they may be a pathway or a wick from somewhere else closer to the structure. We also see elements such as hot tubs that are ignitable and can form fuel. And if you think about that for a second, it might be a giant vessel of water, but the outside of it is typically made and finished with a wood detail or some kind of composite fiber product. And then there's a set of steps that are leading up into the hot tub itself, and those are capable of catching embers and debris. And so if you get the exterior of the hot tub ignited, it may take a while for the water to finally be able to be released and put the hot tub out. But in that meantime, it may have released quite a bit of heat, as you can see on this lower left image here. We're also going to talk about plants, and they come in different forms from, I'm going to talk about foundation plantings, those that are really close to the outside of the structure or the foundation. We're going to talk about hedges, which are, often planted in a row, and sometimes they're sculpted, sometimes they're sheared, and at the base of them, there's often a lot of dead material. And then I want to bring in a new, to me, kind of term is really this kind of block walls where you see a decorative vine, often a woody vine, coating or covering that block wall to soften it, which really looks beautiful. But it's quite easy to ignite that vine, and depending on where it goes, it can lead, if it's ignited, directly towards the structure. So, much of what we like, much of the way that we appreciate how we live, is involving things that can become fuel. And so, what I'd like to offer you tonight is an idea around how do we think about mitigating some of that, so that we can have the win-win, so that we can have the beautiful home that has the fire resilience, that protects our assets and our investments, as well as our families and our communities. Another sort of foundational concept is this concept called fuel ladders, and it's most typically thought in the wildland context where you've got maybe taller vegetation, and the idea is that fire, as it approaches and moves through the environment, it might climb the rungs of the ladder or the rungs of the branches to get into the taller parts of the vegetation. And we can see that same kind of framework as we get closer to our structures, where fire can climb and travel through shorter statured vegetation, and then it might hit some of our built structures like the fence here, and that enables fire to climb to the structure itself. So one of the things I'm going to try and help tonight is to say, how can we break those pathways so that it doesn't transmit directly to the structure we have now or the structure we intend to build. And coming to sort of my last sort of foundational concept is really this idea around what do embers look like. And you may have seen some of these, real live videos of what embers look like. I like this image a lot because it really shows the fluid dynamics of ember travel. And, for those of you who are seeing this for the first time, I'd like to ask the question, can you tell which direction the wind is coming from? And I raise that because it gives you a really clear idea of how challenging mitigation is and how we need to think a little bit differently in this. So this is relatively new construction. There's a central walkway, there's new plantings, but you see these streakings as it comes through here. And there's a lot of movement in the image, which is cool, but how can you tell which direction the wind is coming from? And you can do that by this bright line right here, which shows that something has been ignited. And why that bright line is so pronounced here is because the wind is traveling from the left-hand side of the screen towards the right-hand side of the screen. And the embers are moving in the air column, they collide with the wall, and then they drop to the base. And they are collecting at the base of the structure here, right where we have all of these fine fuels, where we have things that are easily ignitable. It looks like there's a couple of decorative plants here. It looks like there's some kind of covering of the soil. And in relatively short time, we've got ignition that's right at the edge of the wall. In a while, I'll talk about the vulnerability of the edge of the wall, but if you can just kind of keep this in mind around fire can travel very quickly, even without flames moving, even without flames running at the structure, and can be in some of our most weak and vulnerable locations on the structure. You can also see this movement of the air and the circulation. So you've got this vertical circulation, you've got this horizontal circulation, and all of that is a product of many things, but in part the shape of the structure itself. And I think of these as like eddies of air. So if you've ever come out on the front of where you live and maybe you're sitting on the front porch if you have one, sometimes you'll see the leaves swirling as you're sitting there, and they're moving in the air in a way that you might anticipate future embers to move in the air. I have places, and I keep a broom on my front porch where I see things swirling, trying to keep the debris off my porch. When you can anticipate if embers are coming with a future wildfire exposure, they're probably going to follow the same patterns. So, my straw broom on the front porch probably not the best idea, but it gives you a sense of like how you might anticipate future fire exposure. So with that, I'd like to move on to a video. This came from Southern California, the coastal fire in Orange County in May of 22. There's no audio within this, but it's fire ignites across the canyon and it travels up to the communities on the top of a steep slope. One of the things that's interesting is you can see there's all this fuel management, this defensible space, yet embers were still capable of reaching the houses, and you can see those burning roofs at the top of that steep slope, even though there is some setback. Embers were capable of getting through the vents and into the gutters, and we can see that these buildings needed a little bit more. It wasn't enough just to have that fuel break. There were some needs for the structures themselves. Most of these homes, if I remember correctly, were built in the late 80s, early 90s. They're before the new vent guidance came about. And so you can see the way they were oriented. It was pretty easy to trap some of those embers. And the vents were porous enough that they allowed the embers to enter. So using that just to kind of keep in mind some performance standards, some performance examples is one thing I'd like to bring forward. Here's another video. This is from this last year in 2025 down in, I think this is the Eaton fire here. And oh no, it's not going to play. I can see it says cannot play movie. So what I wanted to show here was that basically we lost the house adjacent. We've got a block wall and there is a covering on that block wall, and we get a lot of damage to these windows right here. So the radiant heat exposure from that adjacent structure led to substantial damage to these windows. But what we saw was that the vinyl glazing that held in the window frames began to deform, almost get soft, not quite melt, but soft enough that the window panes were both cracking and starting to fall out. So just that relationship between one structure to the next can lead to some issues. So to kind of summarize what we're talking about, this is a kind of silly clip art diagram that I put together, but I want to just share how we move from a wildland fire to one where we are dealing with issues in the very deep urban community. And these are events that I'm referring to that are where we lose the most homes, and those tend to be in time periods when we have quite a bit of wind associated with a fire. So, you can imagine the wind gusts that were happening in January 2025. They were certainly really extreme. But once we had ignition in the wildland, fire was pushed both by the dry vegetation and the wind. And so it was capable of transferring from the wildland to the built environment and into the residential landscapes. I saw many examples of this. So, wildland vegetation, and all of a sudden we hit the cultivated landscape. And that vegetation starts to burn. It could be the block wall or it could be a fence, and then fire is traveling down that fence until it hits the black house. And the black house, may or may not be resilient to that fire. But if it is not, then we get ignition in that black house. Simultaneously, we see that embers are moving long distance, and if we get ignition of the black house itself, embers may begin to be generated from the black house and lead to further movement of embers deeper into the community. And so you get this kind of domino effect where you've got multiple forms of exposure, this ember component this direct flame contact. And then once you've got ignition of structures, then you can have this radiant heat related issue, and you can have heat exposure between structures, causing further challenges. In most fire events, the period of burn can vary, and there can be different trajectories, different time periods. And so, while it may seem a little hypothetical to have a fire moving in contrary directions, sometimes the wind changes. And so, assume you had another fence, you could be bringing fire back to the same area, or connected vegetation, you could be bringing fire back to this area. And so, it's this interrelationship of fuels of many different types that lead to that succession from a wildland fire into an urban fire. So, what do we do about that? And what I'm here to talk about today is really, how do we break those pathways? How do we slow that process down? So if we were focused on the black house, one of the techniques would be to upgrade the fence or the gate here to something that's non-combustible. So that if even fire does track on the fence, it's going to run out of steam and won't reach the structure itself. In the structure in the middle, if we harden that structure by improving the vents, we might not have ember penetration into the structure. We might not lose this second structure. If we reduce some of the connected fuels between these structures, we might also break that pathway. So it's not about living without, vegetation. It's about being thoughtful about how do we disconnect some of that vegetation as well as built environment fuels in a way that we can slow this process down, give firefighters more chance to respond to fewer structures and be more successful in that space, and in a sense, flatten the curve of home loss to something that becomes more manageable. And maybe eventually we no longer lose houses to wildfire. But at this point, most of California is built out, so we've got a lot of structures that need to be retrofitted. I'm going to hop all around here. I want to talk a little bit about development and siting, and this is sort of finishing off that concept around how do we think about building new, and sort of some of the fundamental concepts here. A lot of us, love a great view and an opportunity to bask in that view and enjoy the outside elements. And it's common to see structures built at the top of a slope and overlooking that gorgeous view. But we know that fire also tends to travel uphill, and as it does, it preheats the vegetation and the structure as it travels uphill. And so that creates a lot of pressure on the structure that sits right with that awesome view. So if you are in this place of building new, the idea of providing a little setback, a little movement away from the slope, if you can, gives a little more clearance and a little more ability to kind of slow this process down, and so you don't get as much heating. I know that not everybody's sites will allow that, but I just want to, plant some ideas that might make sense in your particular situation. Later, I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we arrange our developments, and whether we have a hard edge to them as shown in the lower left, or more of a diffuse boundary where there's houses where the lot sizes are maybe bigger and they're more connected to the wildland fuels, and kind of some of the considerations there. But I just want to give a shout out to my colleague Max Moritz, who's thought quite a bit about this space. He's got a great publication here, which I reference if this is something that's of interest to you. A key principle I'd like to leave you with, so one of the big ideas here, is that it's important to plan for all future building locations and their fire resistance. This is an example on the right of an aerial shot from Paradise, California, from the Camp Fire, and there was a relationship between home loss and distance to the nearest lost structure. So even though the lots may look really big, they were quite close to each other, and you can see this radiant heat issue playing out. And so the strongest predictor of loss was really the distance to the nearest lost house, meaning that the closer there was a burning structure, the more probable that the structure in the study would be compromised. So if you're starting with a brand new lot, or a larger lot, or whatever, if you can anticipate, as my graphic is showing here on the left, kind of those future building needs and be thoughtful about all of them meeting the same standards as the primary building. Because the small building, even if it's subordinate and even if it has something of little or less value than the primary structure, if it is lost, if it's close to the primary structure, it may become that weak link and allow fire to transmit to the structure. So, even if you can't afford to build everything right now, be thoughtful about what you're going to add. And if you're going to add one of those extra little tough sheds or, something in later, make sure that it meets the same standards as your primary building because it is connected. There is a relationship to all the buildings around the structure. We're going to dive now into home hardening and design stuff respective or materials and different elements respective to the structure. I'm going to go in through a variety of different topics here. We're going to talk about the roof and the roof condition and building standards respective to the roof. With that, if you're building new, you're going to get a Class A roof. And so it's less about the materials itself, and we'll talk a little bit more about the design of the structure respective to the roof. We're going to talk about vents. I've hinted at those a bit, and vents come in a variety of different locations from the top of into the attic to the under eave area to foundation vents shown here, and some other locations. We're going to talk about gutters and how the gutter assembly comes together. We're going to talk about how the eaves are designed and what the under eave condition looks like. I'm going to mention a bit about this idea of roof as shown here, this covering deck area to the wall and how those component comes together. And then I'm going to talk about vegetation at the end and kind of the fuels around the structure, both underneath the deck, the attached gate, and then how we beautify with landscaping around the outside of the structure. I'm going to leave you with some references. This is where the fire hose kind of starts to take off because there's a high nerd factor into this topic, and just want to encourage you to open the door to what component of the structure you're interested in at the time it's appropriate to you. And hopefully I will say a few things that hint at some things that you might want to follow. And so I apologize for just moving kind of quickly through all of this. So roofs, on the lower left, I'm showing, this idea that I think the roof really defines the structure itself, and it really is reflective of the era of construction. Right now, we're seeing kind of a resurgence in shed roofs, which surprised me. The gabled roof on the lower left has been around for a long time, but what we've really popularized in the last couple of decades is this idea of very complex roofs, as shown in the structure that's coming together here, where you've got lots of roof planes, you've got different parts of buildings, kind of like Lego blocks, kind of connecting to each other, and you have this just very complicated arrangement. And I bring that forward because that complicated arrangement can create nooks and crannies for debris to collect, as shown here on the left-hand side, where the dormer is catching fine needles and debris from the vegetation, and that has the potential to ignite. And then you've got this place where the roof plane has a high fire resistance, but potentially the wall itself does not. So I'll leave you some food for thought. In terms of, do you want to build a structure with a very complex roof? Can you get your same attributes with something simpler? And if you need that more complexity, then how do you protect the siding that may erupt from the roof plane or may attach, as shown here, as you've got a dominant and subordinate side of this very big building here. If it were all about fire, I guess what I would say is the simpler it is, the better, and the continuance of the roof plane in the most simple ways, like as shown here with this gable roof, may have some attributes that are worth considering. But I get it. This has a big deal to do with the aesthetics, the design, and the thought about, what kind of image are you presenting with this structure. I'm going to talk about vents briefly. If you're not aware, vents have been for a long time really just designed to keep rodents and other animals out. And so the mesh screen size was a quarter inch, sometimes even greater, and that was sufficient to keep those kinds of critters out. But it's also allowed these embers to be able to move through the screening, and they'll still be of a size big enough that they may ignite something if it's combustible once they travel through the vent. So we've been promoting this finer mesh size screening, this 1/8 inch. If you are subject to California's wildland urban exterior construction standards, then there's a requirement to use this whole class of new vents that are designed to resist both flames and embers. If you're not, I'll just say it's a really good idea at this point because these vents have systems that are really gonna still facilitate that moisture management and the air circulation, but provide that additional protection from embers and flames. So more to dig into on that topic, but just want to plant a seed of a really important decision point that you have, and what a great choice it is to be able to start from the beginning with these kinds of events. Here's another kind of big idea. So we were talking just a minute ago about the idea that flame travels and heat travels uphill. And so if you do have one of these locations with a fantastic view, another idea would be to spin the house, either the house or the roof plane, to avoid catching embers. So here I'm just going to show you on the very right, you've got, there's a variety of different embers. There's gable vents, there's roof vents, there's under eave. But if you're in a particularly windy place where fire is prone, you might think about kind of the house as a catcher's mitt for all of that stuff that's going to be moving through the air column. So is there a way to try and not hold on to some of that stuff and let it just blow over the roof, or can you move it back a little bit more? So the shape and configuration might be an aid going down the line. The under the eave area has a variety of issues. I'm showing some older existing construction standards. The issue with the under eave space is that if you get ignition of something underneath the eave, heat can be trapped, flame can move up the wall, embers can penetrate, and you can get quite a lot of exposure under the eave. In most structures, we see open eave designs with freeze block vents, and more recently, we're starting to see softened eaves with some kind of strip vent. So in other words, you don't see the rafter tails. The rafter tails really, really common during kind of that craftsman style. They have an interesting look about them. We're tending to move towards these boxed in softened eaves. So if you're designing new, these boxed in eaves have far superior protection when it comes to fire overall. And I'll just kind of leave you with an idea that if you can, the whole eave should be of ignition resistant materials. And if you can move the soffit or the soffit vent closer to the gutter itself, then it's less in that area where the heat and embers collect. Another consideration is, well, how deep should the roof line be and the eaves? Should I have a shorter shorter eaves? I call it one of those houses like a severe haircut, or is it okay to have deep eaves? And so let's just talk about what the function of eaves and gutters are. They're really about how to protect the lower component of the wall and the siding from moisture. And so, I think where Steve and I land is the closed eaves are probably the most important thing when it comes to fire. And then the eave width, that's a consideration for the climate you live in and the amount of water exposure you have and the siding material that you might choose. So there's some trade-offs there, and there's some design elements where there are different components to be thinking about. But this little detail, which maybe most of us don't spend that much time looking at, has some bearing about structure survivability. Now I want to talk just briefly about the height of the foundation. Here is an idea of kind of planning for a taller foundation. While that might mean a little more cement, is something worth considering. There's been a bunch of lab experiments at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety showing different heights of this foundation, 2 inches versus 0 versus 6 inches. And 6 inches provides the most superior protection for the edge of the wall, which I'm going to talk about next. So it really depends on, of course, the slope, the geologic considerations, what your soil can accommodate respective to how you build there. But that taller foundation of at least 6 inches does a lot for ember protection and protecting the edge of the wall here. So speaking of the edge of the wall, this is a slightly busy slide here, but I just want to bring forward this idea that the way that, let's look at the upper right here, that the wall is assembled matters, especially when you don't have that taller foundation. So what you typically see is you've got the construction style where you've got some kind of studs that build the main framing of the structure. It gets sheathed. Here it's shown with plywood. It could be oriented strand board. And then there's some kind of house wrap, and then there's cladding on the top of it. This is shown with a bevel siding here. When there is this protected edge with base flashing, that really protects this whole assembly of the plywood, the house wrap, as well as the wood product, or in this case, the bevel siding. We don't know whether it's wood or not. Without it, which is shown here on the right, you can see how that is sort of open and exposed at the base. And I bring this forward because the more debris that collects at the base of the house or the structure itself, this becomes this weak point. We saw that image earlier with the embers traveling around that firefighter, and they were collecting at the base of the wall. And so depending on the flame height of what's left at the base of the wall, this edge of the siding can become compromised. So here's an example in an existing construction with a wood-sided product, and you've got this kind of wood plate at the base. They protected it with a wood plate, and it's right next to mulch. And a woody mulch here. So you can imagine how easily it would be to ignite that wood mulch, ignite that base plate here, and then have fire travel up the exterior of the wall as well as the interior. And I just want to share this because it's not just about the siding type, it's also about the assembly in general. So the image on the lower left, on the left, is of the house wrap that is at the base of the wall, and this is with a stucco assembly. The house wrap in this case is something that it is flammable, and you can get debris caught at the base here, and the fire, if there's sufficient debris there, can potentially impinge on the edge of the wall itself, or behind the stucco, or to behind wherever the insulation may be. And so you can get this kind of stair-step process that leads to how this edge of wall is finished. So there's a lot to say here. I just really want to tease out an idea and say this edge of the wall is something we really need to pay attention to, both in the retrofit, but especially when you have the chance to build new and build fresh. There's a lot about decks to be talking about as well, and how they're attached, and some kind of new innovations around decks. I'll just say, I mean, I love decks. I love to have a space to be inside and outside, and there are some newer thoughts around how to build decks that allow for metal flashing for the ledger board to connect, to maybe integrate a non-combustible metal member that looks just about the same size as the 2x6 that is made up the rest of the deck. And the thoughts here are really about, if you do get ignition in the deck, how to prevent it from traveling directly to the structure, and just giving the structure a little bit more clearance itself from what may be a future fire exposure. There are also are some ways around how to wrap the deck joists or cap the deck joists with some foil face tape to prevent the smoldering and the ignition moving on the joists from board to board to board. So here's a retrofit example of how to build that in. So some newer ideas on really how to assemble decks that are not expensive, that you will not fundamentally change the overall cost, but can maybe help improve their performance. I want to kind of also share another idea around when you do build, especially for these lower decks here on the upper right, where it's just a couple feet off the ground. Here's a best practice where you've got non-combustible material all around and underneath the deck, but you have exposure where debris can still collect in there, animals can still get in there, and so a lot of us have used out, but that's super fire vulnerable, very thin in overall dimension, easily ignitable. And so I just want to bring forward, there's some recommendations around using a metal mesh to screen that in. I know of one product by Wildfire Defense Mesh, and I just thought I'd share it with you on this lower right, where you can see how it's coming together at the foundation on this structure. It's being used for slightly different purpose, but I can imagine that this structure would look quite nice with that darker colored metal mesh, something not shiny that would help enclose that deck and still allow for airflow, because precipitation is going to come down in some form, travel through the deck, collect at the base, so you have to allow for airflow, or else you'll get the lower structure having degradation issues. So, here's the kind of trade-off where you could still use some kind of mesh to protect it, but it won't ignite in the same way that the wood does. As I start to wrap up some of the big ideas here, I just really want to encourage people to be thinking about ember defense from the start. So I showed that image earlier on the right, how embers are moving and where they tend to concentrate. And here's another view of that house from Siskiyou County, where you can see how they've thought about it from the very beginning. They've created their passageways, their walkways of non-combustible materials kind of right immediately adjacent to the structure. And I anticipate they're going to be filling in these brown soil areas with vegetation over time, where it enables kind of the focal point to still be present, but the protection is given from this non-combustible kind of skirting pad around the whole structure. And so if you're starting fresh, what a great opportunity it is to bring some of these concepts forward, as well as thinking about the fence connection and how to break that fence to house connection by using a metal gate as the attachment point instead of a wood gate, as well as really designing in that future landscape that you can maintain, that meets your aesthetics, but is just giving the structure a little bit more space, and not a moat of something that's combustible, but an area where it's if you get embers, there's much less likelihood of some type of ignition right against the structure. So as you're thinking about the rebuild of the structure, to be thinking about how you're going to landscape, where you're going to landscape, and how to find that win-win that you can maintain through time. We're starting to get some new images around what this might look like. Here's a recent one that I ran into I really like. Question here is really about the gate itself, and there are some aluminum gates these days that actually look just like wood, so you can't even tell. They're very, very similar here. So this quite possibly could be that, or something else. So in California, we talk about a 3-zone defensible space system, and coming online is this the new zone 0, that is right around the structure. I know many of us may live in smaller, tighter communities. You're only required to be thinking about it to the property line, and just encourage some good conversations with your neighbors as you're rebuilding together, perhaps around kind of how you share in that sort of mutual protection between each other, and how to find that way to thread the needle to give the win-win between each other, and think about how you are in each other's perimeter and peripheral protection for the houses themselves. I do want to talk a little bit about development as well. So we see different patterns of development, and there's a lot of different interests in encouraging or discouraging certain patterns of development. this one on the left is low density, and you've got a different road network, and you've got houses more spread apart. The one on the right has more concentration, more open space, and has sort of, different related issues. When it comes to fire, what I just like to share is sort of some of the trade-offs. The advantage of the one on the left is you get less impact from the surrounding buildings because you've got less density. So if you get ignition in one building, you're having less likelihood of that conductivity or that radiant heat from one building to the next. Um, but you have more, perhaps your resources are more spread thin because you end up with more edge, in essence, more connection to that wildland fuel. And so, there's some trade-offs respective to that. Whereas on the right, you get more impact from the surrounding buildings because everything's a little bit denser. And so thinking about embers becomes a much bigger component here as that density increases. So, the vulnerability in some ways is dependent on the weakest link in there, and your fire response time. So, I'm not saying that there's a perfect solution in all these different settings. Just if you're using that fire lens, it might look a little bit different than how we've thought about density and density development for much of the last couple of decades. So California has a wildland exterior building code. It's called Chapter 7A. It now goes by the Wildland Urban Interface Code, or CWUICI, which is part of the California Building Code under Title 24. I'm going to hint at a couple things as we wrap up here. Within that is a building materials listing. So as you're starting to think about building, there are different choices, and you can learn more about whether a certain product is listed as meeting these code standards or not. I know Katie will send some links later, but just to say here you can dive into this material listing site to learn more. It's a bit of a bear. I just want to warn you, it's about each building product and how it meets standards. But your contractors should be aware of it. And you guys can talk through kind of building product trade-offs and considerations if you're building new. So I want to talk about two things. Is Code Plus recommended, and how much does this stuff cost? There's an organization called Headwaters Economics that recently did a study respective to California and asked about our exterior building codes, and what they found is to build a 1,750 square foot home, and they used the example of Southern California, it costs about 2 to 3% of the total construction costs to meet the new standards. And then there's also an organization called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and they've created their own set of standards. And this is, in some cases, helpful to get insurance moving forward. And so they have two different classifications, one base and plus. And so this study also looked at the costs associated with meeting their standards. So 2 to 3% overall, additional to build to these new standards. And we're getting better and better data in to see that when homes are built to these higher standards, they do fare considerably better than when they're not. And I want to wrap up around plants and plant flammability, and just a couple terms here. We talk about resistance and resilience, and in landscaping terms, if you're talking about a forested environment or the wildland environment, resilience is the ability to recover or restore, and that's because it has some kind of system, like a sprouting system, to basically reestablish itself. And resistance is the capacity to oppose fire. So when you're thinking about the plants of the future, I just want to leave you with this idea that plants are very complex, and it's really about the right plant and the right care and the right place. And all plants require maintenance. And you can take a plant that's, that collects a lot of its dead stuff, and you clean that up and prune it and make it better. You can also neglect a plant, and it's going to get old and woody and hold on to a lot of its dead stuff. And so, plant condition changes radically. So, there are some guidance around, selecting more of the low growing, open structured plants, but it's really about how close they are to the structure and how close they are to other planting groups that I'd like to suggest more so than the label itself or whether it's native or drought tolerant. So, choose plants that you can maintain and that you can care for and that are, less likely to cause compromises to the structure overall. And there are lots of examples that we see where we see as vegetation matures and it becomes harder and harder to maintain, that it becomes the pathway for um, the ignition of the structure. So here's a picture from the Eaton fire, and this is a hedge. And then there was a conifer here, a decorative conifer, and fire, traveled through that vegetation and then was able to create flame impingement on the fascia of this building. And I know from firsthand account that there was firefighter response that led to the extinguishment of this vegetation here and protection of that structure. Where on the right here, this is from the Palisades fire, and there was very clear evidence of firefighter response all around this structure. And even with this, relatively robust walkway, there was a line of vegetation that was about 6 to 12 inches wide. And they stuck in some plants, I would say, quite miraculously, even in that small amount of soil contact. This one got quite big for its britches. And we had ignition at the base of that vegetation, and it was starting to move up into this larger plant overall. Firefighter response was key to stopping that progression. So just thinking about pathways and connections and what you can maintain over time and what plants are going to look like, how big are they going to get, are they really in the right place is just the idea I'd like to leave with you. And then, this idea of like, what are those wicks? Here's some, non-combustible walls, retaining walls, block walls. When we cover them in vegetation, that can be really aesthetic, and that yet it can also connect to some of our structures. So they're a way to kind of do both, but protect the structure itself from that block wall that is adorned with some kind of vine that softens the wall, of course, but may provide that connective relationship. You'll get some information about different standards and different information at the end of this webinar. I talked briefly about the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Just offer it as a checklist. Not trying to promote that organization, but they do a nice job sort of assembling some of the ideas and giving some guidance around the things that they're looking for. And so that might be another place you want to check in with to learn a little bit more around how the insurance industry and researchers are thinking about these issues and different choices and considerations as you start to rebuild. And I'll leave here with a little tale from Colorado, not from California. I was involved in some post-fire work in Colorado. This is a house that on the left is basically just a shell left. The whole house was pretty well impacted by wildfire. There was fire suppression that prevented the further spread from the house on the left. And I just wanted to show kind of what it looked like before or just after the fire. And so there were two different homes. There was a wood fence connecting between. They had a lot of rock mulch, and they had some woody plants within that rock mulch. This conifer, which is the one on the right-hand side, just from the opposite view, was ignited during the fire, and it produced flames sufficient to ignite the under eave area, and then fire got into the attic of the structure. And so I had the privilege of being able to go back to Colorado this last year, and I drove by this house. I was curious what happened. I don't know who bought it. I don't know if it's the same owners. I don't know the level of guidance that it comes to the rebuild process, but I thought I'd just share with you what it looks like a couple of years later. And you can see the same wood fence, and you can see a lot of the rock work. But now they've added combustible mulch at the base of the vegetation plantings. They do have a tall foundation, but they've added some conifers here that, from what I know about plants, are likely to be quite large quite soon. And so, we have one chance to rebuild. And I just really want to applaud you all for diving in, exploring a bit more, learning a bit more, and thinking about, what choices you have at this complicated moment. And I know it's not easy to rebuild right now. And I know there's a tremendous amount of barriers that make it difficult, but where you can make choices. I hope this webinar has offered some ideas as food for thought as you go through that adventure. And I recognize it's not that easy. So, in summary, when it comes to new construction, I just want to say there's a lot of reasons for hope. There's a lot of things that are working, and we can see in post-fire studies that the California construction codes are helping, and they are helping buildings survive. So I'm just going to kind of wrap through this laundry list. And I didn't talk about this now that I think about it, but dual paned tempered glass windows are superior to non-tempered glass windows. And if you can afford them, I'd recommend them. And where buildings are close to each other, I really encourage that. Vents, we talked about flame and ember resistant vents. We talked a bit about the roof and the Class A standard, and that most people are that's not an issue because that is the sort of common practice these days. We hinted at some thoughts around the structure and the structure design with some idea that it could be worth thinking about the complexity of the structure and the roof design. Um, Gutters, we didn't talk about, but I just really want to say if you are in an environment where you get a lot of debris moving through the air, that using metal mesh gutter guards or covers are really a recommended approach. We talked some about decks and enclosing the underside of the decks and some of the installation details. And then we also talked about how to think about what you surround the structure with, and this idea that if you can move some of the walkways closer to the structure, add some of that taller vertical clearance, that taller foundation, and then if you are to build a fence, that if it's to be attached, then at least that last panel or the gate should be made of metal. And then some idea around the future buildings that you might need and sort of the space considerations you might need, with the idea that those future buildings should be made of similar construction standards and similar maintenance standards as you do on the primary house. And lastly, just this idea, if you're close to to one of those fantastic views and the edge of the slope, thinking about where you place the building might matter. So, here's an idea of what that might all look like. This was inspired by some students at Berkeley as part of a design competition. I think for me, I like that in this image there's people in it, and that we're really creating that livable indoor-outdoor space and thinking about the relationship between buildings. I know not all of us have this much space, but just, as we think about a fire adaptation, it certainly means that that there are choices that we can make that may put our structures and our lives and our communities in better position moving forward. So I will close by saying that you'll get links to a number of resources and more information should you want to pursue these ideas. And thank you for hanging on a whatever this is, a Monday night. So I will stop sharing and turn it back to you, Katie, and apologize for just covering way too much too quickly, but hopefully that met some of your interest, and look forward to a conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Yana. We do have a couple questions already for you. And then folks can feel free to raise their hands and ask the questions or type it in the chat. But the first question we have for you, Yana, is from Jeannie, and they ask, how do we find a contractor who's knowledgeable about fire-resistant building?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. At this point, there isn't a certification yet for contractors. Our team has just taken on a new project where we hope to get to a higher level of certification for contractors themselves. But what I would encourage you to do is have a good conversation. I know that if you're in an area where a number of homes were lost, the competition is real steep. And so there's just availability may be really critical. So I think it kind of depends in that situation around finding the right person for you and doing the best you can to make sure that you can promote some of the ideas that meet your values and meet code, depending on what the code is in your exact example, and whether you're building to Code Plus or whether you're building to the Chapter 7A standards or what it is. So we're hoping to be able to be more helpful in that space, but it's a bit tough right now. So I apologize about that.
Thank you. Christy asks, are there any A&R fire resilient mini watershed landscape files? I'm not 100% sure what this is referring to. So Christy, if you're able to, do you mind coming off mute and elaborating?
Hi, Katie. Yeah, so I was just curious if there are any UCNR files or any, documentation on installing mini watersheds that retain water underground and keep the plants more uh,
Are you
moist.
referring to like hugelculture?
More down under the ground than above ground, but similar idea. But digging down and creating these mini watersheds that are underground by digging down 12 inches, 12, 24 inches, and then planting the plants within that space. We just did some of this at the park, but I was curious if UCNR had anything for residential.
Okay, I think I'm following you. So you're referring to basically some kind of passive systems to help plants be more hydrated throughout the growing season by kind of creating mini catchments underneath the planting environment. Is that correct?
Yes, so they're not as dry.
Yeah. Um, Not that I am aware of. Um, and I don't know, Katie, maybe we can run it through our horticulture team and see if there's anyone who's been working in that space. That being said, I just want to, express that there are, I think, different kind of points of contact respective to the hydration of the vegetation. And, um, certainly we have to plan for drought resilience and what limited water from time to time. So I certainly do appreciate all the creative thinking that we can get here, and you know the mixture of what the soil types are, and whether that soil has the water holding capacity or whether that's it can be added and augmented in some way to improve the water holding capacity for future plants. So
Yeah, thank you. Anything that can be sent out later would be wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. All right, our next question is from Emmy Davis. They ask, are aluminum exterior, wood interior, double pane windows a good choice?
yeah, so it's got an aluminum cladding on the outside, and then it's double pane window, but then wood member on the inside. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic choice. Unless Steve, you want to pipe in and add something to this.
Good choice. I would just say what we haven't talked about is the building code only requires one of the two panes to be tempered. Um, if so, two panes tempered is better than one pane tempered. But if you're going to do one pane tempered, it should be the interior pane. The exterior pane should be the regular glass, non-tempered pane.
Yeah, great
I think there'll be a change in the building code that will make that code, but right now, research has shown that it's better to have the outside member be not non-tempered if in fact you're going to have something other than both panes tempered.
Yeah, and so like what Steve's talking about, I think of it like the outside pane is like the storm door for the primary door, which is the inside pane, which is the tempered glass. So you're providing that extra layer to protect the primary inside glass.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, our next question is from MJ Lee. They ask, I was disappointed to see those Marshall Fire rebuilt homes. Any idea why they didn't require zone zero vegetation on rebuilds?
I'm not from Colorado, so the
Well, but
standards are,
even in California, it's not a requirement today.
yeah, yeah. I think that's the question. Like, what do we lead between the carrot and the stick, between, you all who are here, um, trying to learn more versus what should be mandated. These are, I think, bigger societal questions in terms of where should standards apply, where do best management practices come in, who's the trusted partner to communicate the information, what was shared, what was not. I think there's, so much desire to get people back on their feet as quickly as possible too, and 100% understand that. So, it's a complicated landscape, and I just hope that we can become more thoughtful and um, bring some good ideas to those that, have the opportunity to rebuild or build, and do it in a way that doesn't create undue burden on folks so that they can get their lives back in order.
Thanks, Yana and Steve. Anyone else have any questions for our speaker? It's a small enough group, so if you feel comfortable, you can just come off mute and ask your question.
This is Jean. I don't have another question, but my husband and I lost our home in the Eaton fire. And this is really one of the best webinars we've attended. So thank you.
Good job, Yana.
Yay. Well, Jean, I hope you're, one foot in front of the other. I'm sure there's times where it feels like you're walking backwards and walking in circles through this process, because I know there's so many different things coming at you at once. I think I'll just share, I really struggled tonight to think about how to do this in a short amount of time to leave enough time for questions. And, I think I moved too fast tonight, but hopefully that gave you at least some topic areas to be thinking about. It's not one single building product that's going to do it all. Like, I think there's a lot of folks that are just trying to say, I represent this product, and therefore you're going to be okay. And it's really about systems and assemblies and how the component pieces work together. If we're to leave you with a kind of a big idea.
All right, we're going to do a last call for questions. If anybody has anything, feel free. All right. Well, I don't think there are any more questions, just lots of awesome praise for Yana, which is well deserved. Great presentation, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. And thanks also to Steve Quarles for guest appearance and helping answer questions. Much appreciated. Um, so just want to remind folks, this is the last webinar in our After the Fire webinar series, where different experts from UC talk about the latest research and best practices for different post-fire recovery efforts in both urban and rural settings. So our first one was on drinking water contamination. Our second one was on soil contamination and remediation. So many of you were interested in that topic, so I want to recommend you check that out. And our third one was on backyard chicken and livestock safety post-fire. And of course, this was our last one on rebuilding and structure loss. If you didn't get a chance to view any or some of the other webinars that were mentioned earlier, or you want to go back and rewatch them, or want to go back and listen to Yana's presentation again, they will all be available on our Fire Network YouTube channel, and I will paste the link in the chat now, as well as if you registered for this webinar, which you all did because you got the link, I will send a follow-up email with resources that includes a link to the YouTube channel as well. And there will be other fact sheets and resources that Yana mentioned tonight too. So, yeah. And if you have any other questions, you all have my email. Hopefully you all have Yana's as well. And so, Yana, do you want to have any parting words?
Yeah, I'd love to see what you guys create. If you feel so inclined, when you get to the conclusion point, we would love to see pictures of what maybe where you were and what you've created. We'd love to be able to share with other communities the choices you've made and to inspire others who may be going through this at some point in their lives. So love to learn from you all. And if you have any key points, things that you feel like really made a difference in your process, always love to collect those stories as well. So we can help inspire others. And I wish you a good journey working with contractors and making these decisions. Not easy, getting through the review process, building permits, design review, all of the stuff, the financing, all not easy. But maybe, hopefully there's some points of that you look forward to as you come out the other side of it, and you can get rid of something funky that was in that old building and you can replace it with something perfect for your family.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again, Yana, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.